I'll just start recording this, but I wanted to also, I wanted to add. I was thinking of you, Maddie, this morning because I learned a Hasidic discourse. It's called the Mimer. It's a talk of the Rebbe, and it's based on a verse in the Talmud. I'm going to keep it short because it's more of a Tanya class here, but just the message I found to be so powerful. The Talmud teaches us that God did a kindness by scattering the Jews amongst the nations. That's what the Talmud says. God did a kindness that he scattered us. Why is that a kindness? So the previous Rebbe explains, because this way, even if Jews are found in a country, and the previous Rebbe said this in the 1920s when communism was horrible in behind the Iron Curtain, and the previous Rebbe himself was incarcerated and threatened with death and eventually kicked out of Russia. But he was thinking the whole time of his brothers and sisters in Russia, and he was saying, even at a time when they can't fulfill mitzvahs, by us fulfilling the mitzvahs for them, it's giving them the strength to stand strong and to find a way to do the mitzvahs and to be connected with God, even behind the Iron Curtain. So that's what the previous Rebbe said in the 1920s. And then just today I was learning it, and then the Rebbe adds that the kindness of the scattering is not just that geographically Jews in one country could help Jews in another country. It's even the kindness is even for the Jews found in the country that's free to do mitzvahs, like in America. But if you're going through a challenge and I'm going through a different challenge, there's a mitzvah in the Torah of releasing a captive. That if a person is, especially in the olden days, when a person is captive and is expected to be ransomed, which was pretty common amongst the Jewish people, that they would have to ransom off their loved ones. The greatest form of charity is to actually help them come up with the funds needed to get back their loved one. So releasing the bound is an incredible mitzvah, but spiritually also, if someone is addicted, if someone is stuck in a certain temptation and seems to not be able to get out, they're captured by it, they're bound by it, by you helping them through that process or doing something in their merit, you're actually strengthening their ability to be able to release themselves. So it's just this incredible thing. So I think, Maddie, when you're talking about you were thinking of doing the mitzvah, I think that itself like helped Hashem to find you the way to make it a reality. To your good thought of doing it should bring it out into fruition. Anyway, so thank you for sharing. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much. I love that. I love about like what you focus on manifests quite often. So be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, thank you, Maddie. All right, we will. So, friends, ladies and gentlemen, we are in chapter 36, which is.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Pardon me for interrupting, but I sent on chat.
Yep, I see it.
Okay.
I see it.
What Abby Hani and.
Yep, I saw it. Okay, so we're learning chapter 36, which is an incredible foundational chapter of Tanya. It's like it's one of the most important messages of Tanya comes through chapter 36, which is awesome. I did a month ago, before our holiday break, I did give almost like a summary of the chapter. So I'm not going to re-give that summary. We have it on recording, thank God. You could, if you didn't catch it, you could go back on jewishnevada.com/virtual, or you could just text me and I'll text you the link, and you could listen or watch it while you're walking your dog or doing any other chores that you have to do. So I'll keep it brief. But one of the main things that we're going to be accomplishing in chapter 36 is, how do you really get to know God? If you really want to get to know someone, I find this to be just a beautiful idea. Don't ask them what they do, because we all know people do things to make a living that they don't enjoy doing. That's not them. They have a job and they have a career, but it doesn't define who they are. Don't ask them, if you want to know who they are, don't ask them what they know, because people study things that they have no connection to and they have no interest in, but they have to get a good mark on this. So they have this knowledge on trigonometry or whatever else, even though it's not their cup of tea. If you really want to get to know the depth of a person, you should find out what they desire. What do they like? If you find out what they like, then you'll find out who they are. Because not even what they need. It's what they like, because they have needs. They have to be met. But when they like something, that's coming from the core of their depth of their identity of who they are. That's actually what the word intimacy, which is such a close connection we could have with another person. That word itself, intimacy, is into me see. If you really want to see the truth of who I am, the great intimacy is what we desire. That's what intimacy is, because you're seeing the depth of my core of who I am. For God, that is the 613 mitzvahs. The performance of the 613 mitzvahs is us being able to be intimate with God, is getting to know what he likes. God desires these mitzvahs. And that's actually why in the Talmud, it's just an interesting thing. The Talmud has so many discussions of so many questions and answers and refutations and new answers. But yet every now and then, it's pretty rare, but every now and then you'll see a person make a statement, a halacha, a Jewish law, this and this is this, and then someone comes and refutes it. So usually the natural order of the Talmud is the person tries to defend it. Every now and then you'll see the person who has been refuted, he's quiet. He doesn't even respond. So usually that means he lost the debate. But occasionally, when he doesn't respond, it doesn't mean he loses the debate. Even to the point where the final analysis, the final law, will actually follow that person who got refuted. How could that be? He got refuted. Why are we utilizing his position as the final say? He didn't answer back. So sometimes his silence is actually coming from a place that's even deeper. Sometimes silence means weakness. Oh, you don't have an answer. But sometimes silence means I can't articulate it. It's coming from a deeper place that's beyond words being able to be spoken. It's coming from a place that's higher than answering your question. It's just, you could see this often, sometimes when you get into an argument with someone, sometimes the best thing is just not even answer, not because you're weaker, but because you're stronger. And as a result, I'm going to be silent. So anyway, the point that I'm trying to bring over here, sometimes your true desire is too deep to even be articulated in words. Sometimes it comes out through tears, which is too overwhelming to explain, or sometimes even tears can't work. So that's really the depth of God, is the mitzvahs that we perform. So, and just the punchline, let me just make sure I make this clear, is that if we really want to get to know God, it's through the performance of mitzvahs, meaning we create the deepest bond and intimate relationship with God, not by studying his Torah, which in a different chapter, we learned that that's a great union and the greatest union. But over here, we're saying something different, that specifically through deed, through action, is how we actually develop the greatest relationship with God. When we do what he wants, we're getting to know God to the greatest capacity. Okay, so that's just a little summary of what we're going to be studying, but I would love to actually study it now inside. So we'll be on chapter 36. I'll pull it up on the screen, but just in case you are following in the book, it's on page 399. Is that what you have also? Okay, perfect. We're all in agreement, 399 on the top, but I'm going to pull it up on the screen now as well. Here we go. Okay, I hope everyone can see. Whoops. Just make it bigger. Okay. Here we go. In chapter 35, let me just say the title, sorry, your struggle is worth it. Section 1, God's disinterest in the spiritual worlds. So I love the titles are great. What does God really interest? What is his real desire is this world. So there's spiritual worlds and then there's our world. In chapter 35, we began a discussion which the Tanya promised would be a great source of consolation and comfort. The question we asked was, why, we asked, do most of us struggle to battle in vain with the impulse to evil, unable to prevail? It almost seems like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. So the question we asked is, the Beinoni sees the success in following the protocol, but what's the point of it all? I'm always going to remain a Beinoni. It almost is he's almost, he sees the method and he sees the success, but he's just losing the desire in it anymore because he's never going to be a tzaddik. So we gave a great comfort to him. The comfort was the following. The answer we learned was that when ordinary individuals, such as ourselves, perform a mitzvah, we engage the animal soul, bringing divine revelation to even the lowest depth of klipa. We bring God's light into, we get God's light to the darkest of places. So just to explain this a little more, sometimes we have to tell ourselves that the greatest way to form a relationship with someone is actually to surrender. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to a relationship is ourselves. Sometimes we put ourselves as involved in the relationship, which is obviously important. So, let me just go back to the relationship with God. When we look at our soul and its relationship with God, as by definition, a soul is going to be in a relationship with God. So the soul feels it, the soul loves God, but by definition, there's a subject and an object in the relationship. There's God and there's a soul. So however close and one that they want to become, they were going to remain as separate. But on the other hand, with our animal soul, that doesn't really have that interest, for it to be able to perform a mitzvah, what it has to do is surrender itself and say, I'm going to put myself on the side and enter this relationship. So when it's doing that, it's actually forming a total bond. The relationship now becomes truly one because it's fully surrendered. So that's what we just said in this paragraph over here, that it's able to bring God's light to the lowest of places because it's fully surrendered, and therefore God's light is not being prevented from entering anywhere. It's totally open as a channel for God's light. Okay, so now let's see what chapter 36 is going to be about. In this chapter and the next, the Tanya will demonstrate that bringing illumination to a spiritually dark place is actually the most important thing anyone in the universe can do. It's nothing less than the purpose of creation. So again, the purpose of creation will be to bring light to a dark place. So we're going to jump right into the chapter. Now, this thing is known, that quote is from Isaiah, the teaching of our sages of blessed memory, that the ultimate purpose of which the world was created, this is a very famous statement from the Chabad, was that the blessed Holy One desired to have a home for himself in the lowest realms. In Hebrew, the words are dira, which means a home, betachtonim, in the lowest realms. So the ultimate purpose of why God created the world was because he wanted to have a home for himself here. So various rabbinic texts have attempted to fathom God's purpose in creating the universe. The author of the Tanya was, of course, familiar with all these texts, but he pointed to this one particular medrash as the overwhelming motivating factor for creation. For a discussion of the various rabbinic sources and the centrality of the midrash, see Rabbi Chaim Miller is actually the author of this translation of another book, 13 Principles of Faith, where it goes at length. So you could also just watch the recording of my previous class if you didn't catch it, where over there I actually go through some of the other purposes of why God created the world, either to benefit others, to bestow goodness, which is the nature of a good God, to bring goodness. Another one is to show his great might and strength. But whatever reason you want to give, that's not the ultimate reason, because there's flaws in each of those reasons. Over here, the Alter Rebbe is saying the ultimate reason is because God wanted there to be a home for him, for God's essence in this world. Now, obviously, this medrash is metaphorical, since the notion of being present in the upper or lower world is not applicable to God, since he fills all worlds. So what does it mean that God would be mainly in this world? God is in all worlds, right? We say, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvaot, Milo Kol Haaretz Kavoda, which means that God fills all the worlds. Kol Haaretz. So what does it mean? So here we're going to go into the explanation. Rather, this is how we should understand the matter. To explain this midrash, the Tanya will draw on the Kabbalistic concept of divine diminishment. or tzimtzum in Hebrew, that we explored in chapter 21. So again, the word in Hebrew is tzimtzum, which means God contracts or diminishes his light, which means when the light was too strong in the upper worlds, this world couldn't be created. In order for this world to be created, in order for physical life to exist, God had to diminish his light, or tzimtzum his light, and then it gives more space or more room for this world to come. So before the world was created, God was the one and only one, which is a quote from the Midrash in Deuteronomy, and he filled this entire space in which the world was created, leaving no room for any other existence. And the same is true now from God's perspective, which means from godliness, from God's perspective, God is still filling the world. God doesn't, in God's perspective, there's nothing else other than God. God doesn't say, oh, there's a world now and we have to work together. God sees everything as part of his light, as part of an extension of himself. Nothing changed by God. There is only a change from the recipient's perspective for those who receive his energy and light, which means on our end, the reception is different. We'll read this paragraph and then explain a little more of Tzimtzum. The process of creation didn't introduce a separate existence from God, but just another perspective. To our eyes, it appears that God has made a separate world and endowed us with a separate consciousness. But from a higher perspective, from God's eyes, everything is just a part of him. As the Tanya will now explain, this feat was achieved by a diminishment, tzimtzum, of God's light, when perceived from the lower perspective through many filters. Oh, so that's a good word. So a good word, filter. So just to explain it, it's an amazing thing to see the different perspectives. This is a very Kabbalistic idea. The idea being that, and I'm sure, Lynn, that you if you studied with Rabbi Asi Spiegel, I'm sure you studied and explored this concept of tzimtzum at length, and we studied it in Tanya previously, many months ago, or maybe years ago. But the idea, in short, is that from God's perspective, even when a world was brought into creation, it never became a full existence, because it's all part of God. So it's not another existence, and now God has a world that he has to tend to. It's all part of God's existence. It's all part of God. That's what God's actually, the word in Hebrew for God, which we will pronounce now as Havaya. It stands for Haya, Hoveh V'yeh. He was, is, and will be. Nothing ever changed in God in his perfection. But in order for the world to come, in order for people and souls to come into this world, in order for that to happen, God had to diminish his light. So to allow from the perspective of the recipient, for there to seem like a world that's its own existence. But what that allows is now to have a world with an existence. And therefore, from our perspective, it seems like there's a higher world where there's more godliness, and there's a lower world, which is where we are. It's all through this concept of tzimtzum, or diminishment, or the word we just quoted is filters, that filters more of that light out and allows more for mundane or world to exist. So it's a pretty elaborate idea and complex, but that I like how he explained it in this paragraph. Okay, so for God's energy and light must be received through many filters, which diminish the light, covering and hiding God's blessed light. As the verse states, for no man can see me directly and live. Right, that's a quote that Steve, we actually just read it in Shul recently on Shabbos, where Hashem told Moshe, when Moshe asked him to see his face, and Moshe answered, no one can see my face and live. We read that on Sukkot in one of the days. And as the sages of blessed memory explained this verse, even the angels called Chayot, which are a high level of angels, that carry the heavenly throne, don't see the glory of God. They can't see God. So in order for it to be seen, it had to be what God answered from the back. It had to be, you could see my back, which is a filter, and more filters until this world is able to come. This veiling of God is caused by the chain of spiritual worlds, which are downgraded rung by rung through many filters, which hide God's energy and light, until so much veiling has taken place that this very physical material world is created. And this physical world is the lowest rung in the chain of spiritual worlds, since there is nothing lower than it in the extent to which God's light is hidden, to a darkness doubled and redoubled. So the absence of divine light results in klipas filling this world to the point that it is filled with klipas and sitra achra, which are entirely opposed to God, saying there's me and there's no one else beside me. So I really enjoy this section 1, which we translated as God's disinterest in the spiritual world. So just to elaborate on this idea of tzimtzum, the main thing that we're answering in this section is, what does it mean that God desires to be in this lower world? God is in all worlds. So what we explain, what's the difference between higher worlds and lower worlds? It's a matter from the perspective of the recipient, from our perspective, through this concept of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is this diminishment, filters, veiling the light of God, that in order for this world to exist, it has to go through the filters, because as long as the godly light was so strong, it left no room for anything else to come out. Once there's it's actually just a parenthetical note. In the Baal Shem Tov has a beautiful teaching on the Shema. In the second paragraph of the Shema, we say this: if we do the mitzvahs of God, we will receive all the bounty and blessings. But if we turn from God, God will stop the rain from coming at its proper time. And the second paragraph has some words over there, but the wording specifically says v'sartem v'avadetem elokim achim, that if you turn away and you will serve other gods, idol worship. So the Baal Shem Tov says that as soon as you start turning away, you'll already start, so quote unquote, serving other gods, which means if your mind is not filled with what it should be filled with, it will be filled with other things, right? We all know that as soon as a child has too much time on their hand, that's when they get in trouble. They always have to be kept busy. I mean, children, every child is different, but there's even some troublemaking children. As long as you keep them busy with the positive things, it keeps them out of trouble. You have to keep them busy with certain things. As soon as they have too much focus or attention on other things, it's going to lead them down a spiraling chain. So through the diminishment of God's light, through this method of tzimtzum, what happened is the light of God is contracted. So now there's more space over there. What is it filled with? Non-light. It's filled with klipa. It's filled with the other side that is taking over as much as they can. So the more the diminishment of the light, the more the klipa is growing. The more the klipa is stronger, taking over more of the space. So in the higher world, where there's more godly light, meaning the diminishment, the tzimtzum, is not as strong, so the klipa is almost non-existent. It's voided. But as soon as the tzimtzum is stronger, which means the veil of God's light is thicker, the klipa is able to be more rampant. The klipa is stronger. The klipa is bigger. So in this lower world is where the klipa, or in another word, the darkness, is the strongest. Until, like in this world, sometimes we could say to ourselves, all this is me. And we all know this all too well, where we could turn and say, it's because of my charisma that I got my career, and it's because of my charm that I got my wealth, or it's because of my good luck that I got this. It's all coming from me, right? The quote is from Pharaoh, where he says, I created the Nile River. He told everyone that he's God, right? Where it's actually just interesting. Where did, if you know, in the opening book of Exodus, the opening portions, where did Moshe meet Pharaoh? In the morning by the Nile River. Why by the Nile? Because Pharaoh was claiming to everyone that he's God and he doesn't have to use the bathroom, because a God doesn't have to use the bathroom. Only humans have to use the bathroom. So he would get up early in the morning when no one was awake yet. He would go to the bathroom, and that would be his way of keeping that frame of mind that he's a God. So specifically, where did Moshe meet him? By the Nile River. I don't know if it was, I hope it wasn't during the bathroom break, but maybe before or after, but just notifying him that I know exactly who you are. Okay. Section 2. Any questions before we continue?
I had heard or read that Also, because he thought he was God, that he was standing in the Nile, which was holy to them, but put his hands up, and as soon as sunlight touched his fingers, he pronounced it day because he was God.
Oh, I didn't know
That's what
that. Where is that from? Where did you hear this? That's beautiful.
I don't know, but I've read it several places, so I don't know.
Very nice. And Lynn, I have to say, it's nice to see you, because most of our other students and class participants, I see either on the holidays or, but you, I don't. So it's nice to have that Tanya connection, that we could still get together. So it's been a while, and I'm glad we're back together. Okay, section 2. Here we go. At the bottom of this Kindle, or 401 if you're following inside. What gives God pleasure? What a great title. The above represents a summary of what we learned in chapter 21, which is about Tzimtzum. Now the Tanya turns to why God should be so concerned about what transpires in the lower worlds. Meaning, why does God care so much of a place that's not even filled with his light anymore? A place that's more filled with klipa. And we say that God desires to be there. Now, the dir betachtonim, which is the Hebrew word from the Midrash, but in English is translated as the home for God in the lowest realm. This idea teaches that the ultimate purpose of the chain of spiritual worlds and their progressive downgrade from rung to rung is not for the sake of the upper world. This seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't God be more impressed by the worship of the angels and celestial beings in the upper worlds who sing to him in harmony and purity? To debunk this myth, the Tanya will first explain why the purpose of creation can't be in the upper worlds. And after that, we will address why it is in fact in the lower world. So it's nice to see this translation is just helpful in seeing the path that we're taking here. First, we're going to explain why God's presence, why God can't desire more to be in the upper worlds. And then we could explain why specifically in the lower worlds. But let's see. Because even these upper worlds represent a downgrade from the actual light of God's face, and God would not have made the entire creation merely to achieve the downgrading of his light. Let's forget about the lower worlds for a minute. Imagine that God would have only created the upper worlds with all the angels singing to him. What would be the point in that? Even the angels don't actually see God. They perceive a highly diminished version of his light. So there's no gain here, no profit to be had, just diminishment. Rather, we are forced to conclude that counterintuitively, the purpose of all the creation must be for the sake of this lowest physical world. Obviously, this world represents an even greater downgrade of God's light than the upper worlds. So clearly, if the purpose of creation rests here, there must be another property of the physical world that makes its creation worthwhile. An upgrade, so to speak. Okay, so just to pause for a second, we're learning foundational ideas here. So again, once again, the Midrash tells us that God had a desire for him to have a home in this lowest world. In the Hebrew, dira, which means a home, bitachtonim, in the lowliest of worlds, which is our world, the place where there's the most diminishment of God's light. So now we're trying to explain why is this world the ultimate purpose of God's creation. And we're explaining first by saying why it can't be the upper worlds. So the upper worlds, if you remember, have less tzimtzum, less of a diminishment, which means more godly light. But still, even in the place where there's more godly light, it's still lower than God's essence, because God, in his core of his being, is all light. It's not only light, it's the source of all light. But then he created a higher world where there's angels, and they perceive the greatness of God's light, and they sing in harmony and purity to godliness, to Hashem. But we can't say that the whole purpose was for those upper worlds, because even though you're right, there's a great level of light, but that's still a downgrade for God. He created a world just to have angels singing and to appreciate that light, but that light is so much dimmer than the way it is by his source. It's still a tzimtzum. Maybe it's not as big of a tzimtzum as here in our world, but it's a tzimtzum nonetheless. So why would God want something that has no profit for him? no gain. It's just a downgrade. So therefore, we can't say that the ultimate purpose is for the upper worlds, because even though it's full of godly light, it's still a downgrade for God. Why would God create something that's lower? Right? Like, think of it. If I got bored of my home, I have a ton of money, and I want to build a new home, it would be unthinkable to imagine that the home I'm going to build is smaller than the home I have now. What was the point? So why would God downgrade his lights to go through Tzimtzum to create the upper worlds with the angels that has no greater light in it than the way it was before? So the Alter Rebbe has explained to us that the ultimate purpose can't be for the upper worlds. So it has to be for this world. But what is in this world that God will desire? There has to be something else in this world that is a profit for God, that is a gain for God. And that's, I guess, what we'll see now. Okay, so at the top of the Kindle or in the middle of 402. Since before any of the worlds were created, it arose in God's will that he would have a feeling of satisfaction. You're familiar probably with the Hebrew, nachas, or nachas ruach. Ruach means the spirit, right, or a feeling. So nachas ruach is that feeling of nachas, that feeling of satisfaction, when his will would be obeyed down in the physical world. It's hard to pin a rational reason as to why God chose what he chose. Ultimately, it's something we can't fully fathom. It's a divine desire or whim, so to speak. But in the following lines, the Tanya will offer some insight as to why a mitzvah performed in the lowest realms is so appealing to God. Okay, so I'm curious to see what it is. So, but we'll see why when we perform a mitzvah, it brings such a nachas to God. For when God's will is obeyed in this world, it causes a sitra achra to be subdued, or in Aramaic, in Kabbalistic terms, the word is iskafia. And darkness is transformed, or isapcha, to light. So that the infinite light of God can shine in the place of prior darkness and sitra achra, which previously filled this entire world completely. Prior darkness. Okay, let's see his words and then we'll explain it. Practically speaking, if you are God and the worlds didn't yet exist, how would you demonstrate the truth that nothing exists outside God? That's a good question. If I'm God, there's nothing else. How do I demonstrate that there's nothing else other than God? One approach would be to do nothing and just leave yourself existing and everything else non-existing. But another approach would be to create a force which tried to conceal your existence, but ultimately failed to do so. And while you would never be fooled by that force, you can make creatures that were influenced by it. You would give them the choice whether to be drawn in by its illusion or to reject it. And while it would be very convincing force and exert power for a long time, eventually the force will be eliminated completely by creatures choosing good over evil. Then you would have demonstrated that nothing exists outside God, because anything that did oppose God was shown to be unsustainable. Every time a mitzvah is performed, we achieve part of that goal. And this gives us some insight into why it brings God pleasure and makes his creation worthwhile. I think I'm going to snapshot this paragraph. It's just such a beautiful way of explaining. I just want to explain this nachas part. So, and if anyone wants to see the screen again, I'll pull it back up in a second. But what we're trying to explain is, so if I want to show that there's no other existence, one is to do nothing and there's no other existence. Another is to create a force that seems like an existence, a darkness that seems to oppose God, and give people the free choice to choose the good or evil. So when people choose that good over evil, it shows that even that force has no power, that there's no existence other than God. So every time we perform a mitzvah, we're bringing proof or validity to this idea that there's no power in the klipa, because the klipa is what's trying to absorb you in doing a mitzvah, trying to convince you in doing something negative, and every sin that we do brings darkness to the world. But when we choose and say, no, I'm going to do a mitzvah instead, I'm bringing more light to the world, I'm going to prevent myself from doing that sin. And by doing that, by preventing a sin, you're also, by holding back or subduing yourself, controlling yourself from doing something that you shouldn't be doing, you're bringing light into the world, ultimately transforming that darkness to light. So when you do that, you're bringing God nachas, showing the validity in God's non-dual existence, in the idea that no other existence is other than God. And sorry, let me just see the questions. I'm just going to read the question from Lynn. So is this the process of creation with tohu vavohu, and God brought order through the bringing of light into the world? And so can we participate in creational order or anti-creational or disorder? So both questions, those are very fundamental questions. So just to explain what Lynn is saying, just to make sure, Lynn, so in last week's Torah portion, the first Torah portion of the Torah, the second verse of the Torah says that the world was tohu vavohu, was empty or chaos or without order. And then God created light, which was the first thing, and then the other 9 utterances, and the creation of humanity with everything else. But Kabbalistically, and I'm assuming, Lynn, you mean the Kabbalistic meaning of tohu in there, right? There's a world of order, which is the world that we're in, of light and vessel, and the light is the right size for the vessel. But then there's also a world, an existence before our order of world that was chaotic, which was the world of too many lights and too small vessels. The vessels couldn't fit. So if you have a thin vessel and you put hot water in it, it can't contain it because it's too strong for it. It'll burst the vessel. So there was a place where the light of God, he showered too much light, and the vessels, the world couldn't contain it, and the vessels kind of exploded. There was no order. So it says, like the soul of Esav, who was the evil son of Isaac. How could Isaac have such a son that was so evil, to the point where it says that Isaac favored Esav over Yaakov? How could that even be? Because Esav came from this incredibly high level of tohu, which was a place of extreme fanatical light, but couldn't be handled. So Isaac thought he could handle it. He could harness it. And there's even just people that, they get nervous breakdowns because they're geniuses. They think too strongly, too powerfully, but their brain just can't keep up, or it leads to almost like a breakdown. So is this world, so I guess, Lynn, your question is this: when we have light that originally was darkness and we're transforming, is that this process of bringing order to the disorder, right? Did I get your question right? Is that your question?
Yes, and when we're doing the mitzvot, are we actually participating in bringing creational order, because we're made in the likeness of Hashem, so that is a blessing to him as compared to doing things that would actually destroy the order that he created and really bring the darkness.
Awesome.
The second thought.
Yeah. So to answer your first thought, absolutely. The Rebbe actually, in the later years, in the late 80s and early 90s, the Rebbe was actually very strong in this idea that our job is to bring down the light of this higher realm of tohu, but bring it into an orderly fashion. Meaning, don't satisfy with only the orderly light. Shoot for the strongest lights, but figure out the way to make a proper vessel to be able to handle it. So that is our job. And every time we do a mitzvah, we are able to tap into this higher level. Especially, it's one of the strongest things the Rebbe loved is when is not keeping Torah in a box, not being limited to just an orderly way of thinking of Torah, that you go to yeshiva and you study Torah. The Rebbe wanted us to think out of the box, use crazy things out there in the world to benefit Torah, to make this world a better place, whether it's internet or Zoom or radio and television. The Rebbe wanted to use things that seemed to be not Torah based, or like things that seem to be opposing, and to take that, or even to do crazy things. Like, the Rebbe had, and some of you probably saw this in Manhattan, or taking RVs and calling them mitzvah tanks, and encouraging people to be able to do mitzvahs on these things. So you're not waiting for them to come to synagogue. You're putting on Jewish music, and you're dancing out on Broadway and Fifth or whatever it is, and encouraging them to come on board and be part of it. So it's almost like this crazy. It's bringing a craziness in a very positive sense to Torah. I'm just going to charge my computer before it dies. And does anyone else have anything to add on that idea that Lynn is mentioning?
I love that the part that I'm experiencing as the more I'm reading Torah the last couple of years is more and more joy. And I'm finding it's infectious. And that's what's fun. I mean, there's times where I'm in the tohu vavohu, but I'm finding more and more that the joy of being closer, and like you're talking in that relationship, it spreads.
It's amazing. Beautiful. Awesome. Thank you. That's very, very nice. Thank you, Lynn. Okay. Oh, so there's this beautiful Hasidic thought. I don't see it on the Kindle edition. So I'm just going to read it. It's at the bottom of 402 if you're looking inside the book. If you don't have the book, it's fine. I'll just read it. And it's just a couple lines. When we say that a mitzvah is the divine will, people usually imagine that we are playing an authority game. You have to do this because it is a divine will. Mystics, however, mean something else when they invoke the idea of a higher will. They are trying to convey that this act represents the fulfillment of a very deep urge on the part of God, a yearning which transcends reason. When a person has a very deep will for something, not always is there a logical explanation behind it. They can't explain to you why they desire it. This is just what I want. This is what I like. I can't make sense out of it. This is what it is. So when it says that we are fulfilling the divine will of God, the beautiful idea here is that it's not just, we have to do it because it's divine will. God summoned us to do it. That's one way of looking at it, and that's the way most of us were taught in Hebrew school. But the beauty of what the mystics or Tanya here is teaching us is that when we do the mitzvah, we're reaching the divine will of God, which is higher than any reason. It transcends any logic of why God wants this. And yet when we do it, we're connecting with God on that deepest of levels, with the divine will of God. And that's a beautiful idea. Okay, let's go back inside. We are in the middle of 402. So, and just the point that we were leaving off by is you can't pin a reason to why God chose what he chose. God wants it. His desire was to live in this world, for him to have a home, a spiritual abode in this world. And why is it? Because God gets great nachas when we either do subduing of our temptations or transformation of the darkness into light, which we do by the performance of mitzvahs. When we do that, we're bringing proof to God's that the only existence is God. So every time we say the Shema, which is pronouncing God, the declaration of faith, that there's only one God. What does that mean? There's only one God? Everything is part of God's existence. Everything is part of God. There's nothing that is outside of God. Everything is part of God. That's what Hashem Echad means. God is one, which means in everything in my life, there isn't Torah and then I have my money. Everything is part of God. Everything is from the blessings of God, and nothing is opposite of God. Our job is to harmonize it all and bring the oneness of God into everything we do. So every time we do a mitzvah or hold ourselves back or control ourselves from a temptation, we're taking the choice to choose good over evil. What we're doing at that moment is we're proving this existence of God, that there's nothing else other than God. Okay, so we are in the middle of the Kindle page, and when God's light, and that's on 403, I'm sorry, and when God's light does shine in this physical world, which was previously dominated by the Sitra Achra, it shines with more dignity and more power, which is a quote from Jacob in his blessing that he gave to his oldest son, to his firstborn Reuven. He says, you're given strength with more Yeser Se'et and Yeser Oz, which means more dignity and more power. So when we transform this light, that light shines now with more power than before. And with the advantage of light, which comes from darkness, which is from Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, which is superior to the way it illuminates the upper worlds, where it must shine through many filters and the hiding of God's face, which hides or at least conceals the blessed infinite light, in order that the individual identity of the upper worlds should not be eradicated, which would be the case if God's light shined unfiltered. So just to explain this, we all know, especially coming from the holiday season with Yom Kippur, we all know that we make mistakes in life, but the question is, what do we do as a result of these mistakes? It could either hinder my development or it could actually spring forward my development. So when a person, whatever mistakes we've made, it could actually be the opportunity for even greater growth. And we all know stories in our own lives of where we've seen that. So you're actually, from the fact that there was darkness in this world, now you're actually correcting that and you're making it light. That light is actually stronger than if it was just light originally. The fact that it was first darkness and now you're making that into light, it's almost like the person who learned from his mistakes and now is more seasoned than a person who never made the mistake, because they have the experience, they have the lesson now, and they have that as a model of how to be better. So in truth, where you're holding now is actually more powerful than the way you were if you never made the mistake. So in this world where there was darkness, and now through your performance of the mitzvah, you're actually transforming that into light. That light is actually a stronger level of light than what existed in the upper world when there was no darkness ever. That light that you have through your transformation is actually more of a direct light, part of God's essence, than the light the way it is on a higher world, which is more of an outside part of God, of the exterior part of God. Okay, we're almost finished the section, and we'll end with these last, I think, 2 paragraphs or 1. When you do a mitzvah in this world, the truth shines. The lie of Kalipa is eradicated. The truth can't shine fully in the upper worlds because they never completely eradicate the hiding of God. They always maintain the status quo of many filters. The fullness of God's mastery is always hidden up there. And while it's usually hidden down here and more so, we can break through that obscuring force and bring his true will to light if we choose to do so. Awesome. So like I mentioned at the beginning, these are such foundational ideas, but we know that in the upper worlds, there's a light of God, but that light never has the opportunity to be stronger than the way it is, than the way God put there. But in this world, where there's also a concealment to the light, through us doing the mitzvah, we actually uncover a deeper level of light that doesn't have the opportunity to be uncovered in the higher worlds. So when we do a mitzvah, what we're doing is we're calling the bluff of the klipa. We're showing the truth that shines, which is the light of God. And in the upper world, that bluff is never proven because there isn't bluff. In this world where there's klipa, we could actually eradicate it and actually shine the light even stronger. Okay, I'll see you Maddie, thank you so much. I hope this made sense. And obviously we could, some of these ideas, there's so much to ponder, and on the next page we'll have more practical lessons. But awesome. I'm glad we got through the first half of the chapter.
Rabbi, what was the thing that you just said a second ago about shining, you shine the light stronger or something when you do God's mitzvahs?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
So in this world where there's a falsehood, in this world there's a klipa that's trying to cover over the light of God. So when we do the truth, when we do a mitzvah, we're actually showing the klipa how false you are. I'm going to shine, the truth shines. So when I shine that truth, that mitzvah, which is the ultimate truth, that shine is actually stronger than any shine that could be in a different world, in the higher worlds, when there is no opposition. Specifically here where there's an opposition. And I'm making it clear that I'm going to actually fulfill the mitzvah. And by doing the mitzvah, you're shining that light even stronger than the way it was above, because there's an opposition of the klipa. So now it's actually with more, the light is more dignified. The light is more strong than the way it was in any of the previous worlds.
Thank you.
Baruch Hashem.
Yeah, and Lynn, you're welcome. Awesome. And I'm sorry, Nancy, what were you saying?
I was just saying that last paragraph just spoke to me about, the truth shines, the klipa is eradicated because we actually have taken our animal soul and said, we're going to do the right thing, which is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to have our animal soul be subservient to God, but we have to actually act, not just think, but it's the actual action of doing a mitzvah.
Okay, so specifically through the action is where it gives God the greatest nachas. And that's what God's desire is. God's whole delight is to see that happen. And that's why God wants to live here. When we do that, we're actually bringing God's light into the world. That's the truth shining stronger than in any other world. That's why God's desire is specifically in this world, where there's a klipa and we're shining the truth stronger than it could be anywhere else. So, and I think, Lynn, to answer your question, I think yes. Is light equivalent to truth? I think so. But I'm curious to know if anyone has a different answer. But I would understand it as yes.
And of course, this week's Torah portion, Noah teaches us about following God's commandments. And, what happens when people don't? And there's all sorts of corruption in the world. And when Noah says, I'm going to be righteous, I'm going to walk with God. And, he does that to the best of his ability, at least during the ark period. That's a role model for us.
Beautiful. Well, Nancy, no pressure, but we're looking forward to this week's Dvar Torah.
I've already started, Rabbi.
Awesome. All right. Go ahead. Sorry.
The reason why I asked this question is it becomes so prevalent today with people saying, well, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. Obviously, it's a rhetorical question because I believe light and truth are the same, but just how we deal with people who have relative truth as compared to what we're talking about seems like ultimate truth.
Ultimate truth. That's actually a beautiful idea. Because truth, by definition, truth means there's one truth, right? So if it's one truth, then it's the real light. Interesting. Could there be separate truths? I don't know. Could there be different lights? It's a good question. A lot to think about. Awesome. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Frida. Thank you, Nancy. Shavua Tov, everyone, and I'll see you next week. Glad we're back in.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so much.